The guns fell silent, the buglers blew their victory tunes, and the crowds cheered. But wait, what was that? Someone said the wrong thing about Austria-Hungary. They're gonna declare war and start the biggest, deadliest war in history. That's right, World War I, or the Great War, or as it was known at the time, the war to end all wars. And so here's how it went down. For centuries, Europe had been a powder keg just waiting to explode. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling apart. The Greeks were angry at the Ottomans for taking their land, and the Russians were like, hey, we can help you take your land back. So the Russians and Greeks got together and kicked the Ottomans' butts. And then the Ottomans were like, I'm calling my cousin Ferdinand over here to help me out. Ferdinand, of course, was the Austrian prince who had met his demise in Sarajevo, sparking this whole thing in the first place. The Austrians teamed up with the Germans and decided they wanted to punish the Serbs for supporting the anti-Austrian rebels in Bosnia. This caused the Russians to step in and protect Serbia because the Russians had promised them that they would. So now you have two groups of people who used to be chumps for the Ottomans fighting against another group of people who used to be chumps for the Ottomans, but now they're fighting for themselves. Oh, and also the Italians joined the party too. The French and British didn't want Germany to dominate Europe, so they joined the fight as well. Now, before I go on, I need you to understand something. This isn't some epic battle where two armies get together and fight it out on an open field. It's more like a series of regional conflicts that all happen to be happening at the same time. The most famous battles took place in France. So, if you think of the war as a pair of tongs, then France is the meat in the middle. So there's this region in northeastern France called Lorraine, which the Germans wanted to annex because why not? And the French are like, no, oh no, we're never gonna let you do that. So the Germans were like, okay, cool, let's go to war then. And so the Germans started moving troops through Belgium to get to France faster. This pissed off the Belgians, who were like, why are you marching through our country? And the Germans were like, because you're in our way. And the Belgians were like, well, fine, hey, come on in, and this gave the French time to mobilize their troops and get ready to fight. By August 1914, the Germans had made it to the Swiss border. The French thought this was terrible news, but the British thought it was fantastic. You see, Britain had this whole splendid little war mentality, meaning they thought it would be kind of fun to go to war. They were especially excited to fight the Germans because they used to be really good friends until those nasty Germans went and invented the word Deutschland über alles, which basically meant that Germany was more important than everyone else. Also, the British had a lot of colonies around the world, and they were worried that if the Germans won, then they might try to take those colonies for themselves. So the British were like, wait, I'm calling my boys over here to help out. But by the time the British got there, it was too late. The Germans had already taken over Belgium and were on their way to Paris. However, both sides needed more soldiers, so they started doing these massive campaigns to get everyone to enlist. But once the novelty wore off and people realized that this war wasn't gonna be over anytime soon, they started getting desperate. The British started lowering the age requirement so that young boys could join. Then the French started offering citizenship to anyone who enlisted. Then both sides started targeting women to fill support roles. As the months went on, the fighting became more and more brutal. Trenches were filled with rats and diseases. Soldiers froze during the winter and burned during the summer. They had to deal with mustard gas, tanks, airplanes, machine guns, and each other's artillery fire. The worst part was that none of it seemed to matter. You see, both sides were dug into these trenches that were miles long and several feet deep. And whenever one side tried to advance, the other side would just shoot them full of holes. This led to something called trench warfare, where neither side could advance. Here's a quote from a French soldier that describes the experience perfectly. We held our fire till our stomachs were aching and the bullets fairly jumped out of the barrel. When the order to fire came, we fired. There was the whistle of bullets overhead, the thud of spent cartridges on the ground, the heavy fall of shells bursting behind us. We could hear the groans of the wounded, the cries of the dead as they fell, the curses of men who realized they were going to die. By 1916, the French and Germans were exhausted, so they agreed to stop fighting for a while. They basically drew a line on a map and said, okay, you guys stay over here, and we lines stay over here, and we lines just chill for a while. But then the Germans were like, actually, you know what? This line sucks. Can we have this part? So the French were like, sure, why not? Have fun with that. So the Germans went ahead and took over this territory right here, which technically means they didn't stick to the terms of their own agreement. But the French weren't about to say anything because they were secretly happy that the Germans were killing each other. In 1917, the Americans entered the war because they were like, oh, hey, we can jump in here and help out the French. So the Germans were like, oh, okay, sure, we were hoping someone would come and save us. But that never happened because the Americans just stood around and watched for another year, and then they helped the French win the war. But before that, the Russians dropped out of the war because they had a whole mess of their own to deal with. You see, they tried to modernize and industrialize their economy, but their leaders were corrupt and incompetent, which led to food shortages, economic collapse, political upheaval, and the rise of communism under Vladimir Lenin. So then the Germans were like, hey, Russia, we're totally done with you. Thanks for hanging out. Later, after 4 years of fighting, the Germans were like, you know what? This sucks. Let's just call it quits. And so they signed the Treaty of Versailles, which basically said, okay, you guys can have all of our stuff and we'll just go home now. And so the Allies met together to decide what to do with Germany, and they basically did the same thing. Okay, you guys can have all of our stuff and we'll just go home now. Overall, the war resulted in the deaths of about 20 million people, including about 10% of all the men in Europe. But even though so many people died, it wasn't exactly clear who won and who lost. Here's why. First of all, there were no more Ottomans or Austrians left by the end of the war. Instead, there was a new country called Czechoslovakia, which the Germans had made just to piss off the Russians. Then the Russians weren't really a major power anymore because they had a civil war to worry about. Then Italy was broke. Then France and Belgium were in ruins. Only Britain and the United States were left standing. But they both had suffered massive casualties, and the US didn't even sign the treaty. So yeah, I don't know. Everyone kind of lost. But the question is, why? Why did so many people die for nothing? Well, historians argue that the war happened for 3 reasons. First, there was a lot of nationalism going around at the time, which made people think that their country was superior to everyone else's. Second, there was a lot of imperialism going on, which meant that European countries were competing with each other for land and resources around the world. And third, there was a lot of militarism going on, which meant that every country was building up their army in preparation for war. And so when those Austrians got triggered by some Bosnian rebels, they were like, you know what, screw it, let's go to war, which is pretty ironic considering that the war was supposed to be about stopping wars. Anyway, if you want to keep learning about this topic, I put a bunch of links to great resources in the description below, so click on those if you're interested. Subscribe if you want me to keep making videos like these, and leave a comment below if you have any suggestions for topics that I should cover in the future. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.